It is my pleasure here today to be speaking with Barbara Mujica and Anthony Marra about their latest books. And so I'll be pulling up my notes here. Somewhere. They're here somewhere. Let me introduce Barbara first. She is a professor emerita of Spanish at Georgetown University. She has a number of novels out and collections of short stories. One of ones that you may be familiar with is Frida, about Frida Kahlo. She also has the book I Am Venus, which takes as its protagonist the Venus from Diego Velázquez's painting. She has her PhD from New York University and did graduate studies at the Sorbonne. She has done both scholarly and literary work focused on Santa Teresa of Avila. So that's interesting that she was able to do both scholarly and fictional. So it's an interesting combination. Two fun facts about Barbara is that she speaks 6 languages that I could see on your curriculum vitae. And she also reviews for the Washington Independent Review of Books. Another reason that you should tag us. And then Anthony Marra, many folks have seen him here at Gaithersburg. We know him as the writer of A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, his first debut novel. Then his collection of linked short stories, The Czar of Love and Techno, and now Mercury Pictures Presents. He's been nominated for and won so many awards, it's kind of hard to go through them all. I have them here somewhere, if only I could find them.
Oh, it's okay.
All right. He's going to let me get by without doing it. Hold on. I know it's here. Somewhere. Nominee for National Book Award, Penn Bingham Prize, Dayton Literary Peace Prize, Andrew Carnegie Medal for Fiction, Joyce Carol Oates Literary Prize, and won Pushcart Prize, Whiting Award, inaugural John Leonard Prize winner from the National Book Critics Circle, and the National Magazine Award for Fiction. So there you go. The fun fact about Anthony Marra is that if you go to his Wikipedia site, the photograph of him is from Gaithersburg Book Festival and it has the big Gaithersburg sign directly behind him. So you know you are in the right place. Okay. All right, so here we are. We're going to get started, and what I'd like to do is ask each of you to read a brief section first, and then tell us a little bit about the story, about what the book is about. So I'll let Barbara go first.
Okay, this passage comes at the end of the book when Dolores del Rio, who's the protagonist and who was the first Latina star in Hollywood, female star in Hollywood, is being honored for 50 years in film. And this is what she says. When the newspapers write about me, what do they say? Even at her age, she is still beautiful. But what is beauty? Real beauty does not come from creams or lotions, but from thoughts and deeds. When we devote our lives to helping others, we become beautiful. When I die, I want them to write, she was a beautiful woman, not because I still have high cheekbones, but because I accomplished something worthwhile in my lifetime. Dolores del Rio is known as a star. She's known as a great beauty. She was chosen by a panel of experts as the most beautiful woman in the world. In the world, got that? That's pretty unbelievable. That was very significant because beauty was defined in the 20s and 30s in Hollywood as blonde and blue-eyed. And Dolores del Rio came to Hollywood and was immediately successful because Hollywood was looking for a female equivalent of Rudolph Valentino. They wanted somebody who was dark. Ruta Valentino was making tons of money for the studios, and then all of the other studios wanted a Ruta Valentino, and they wanted a female one too, and she fit the bill because she was beautiful and exotic, and her exoticism is what really propelled her career. So she was successful from the very beginning. She came to Hollywood before she had really thoroughly learned English, but not knowing English was not an impediment because films were silent in those days. But then in 1927, when talkies were introduced, all of the stars were afraid because they thought that that the audiences might not like their voices. They thought that their delivery might not be what the audience wanted. But Dolores got through that. Her career was able to thrive after that. She was successful because she always played foreigners with an accent. And American audiences at that time were not so sophisticated. The difference between a Brazilian accent and a French accent and a Russian accent, that wasn't clear to most people. So she played all of those parts. She played a Brazilian. She played all kinds of foreigners. And so she was very successful until before World War II. But then as World War II was beginning to loom on the horizon, Hollywood and the public in general became very leery of foreigners. And so she became what was called then box office poison, and she wasn't able to get roles. And so she went back to Mexico, and she landed in Mexico just at the time of the golden age of Mexican cinema. And she restarted her career. She relaunched her career. She was a friend of Frida Kahlo's. Frida knew everybody. And with Frida's help and her introduction to movie directors, Lola, she was called Lola by her friends, launched her career and was a key member of that group and a very successful movie star. She says she always wanted to do something useful with her life, and throughout the book she says, I wanted to do something lasting. And lots of the movies that she made in Hollywood were really frivolous movies. They were silly, and she knew that, and she wanted to make something more worthwhile and give something to the community. She thought that in Mexico, where they were making more socially relevant movies about poverty and abuse of women and that kind of thing, she could make that contribution. And then at the end of her life, she started a system of daycare centers for women who worked in menial jobs like carpenters and cooks and maids, in the movie industry, in the theater industry. And so she did wind up doing something very, very useful.
All right. First, thank you all so much for coming out today and to the festival for hosting us. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking with the two of you. And my parents and wife are in the audience. So I'll be on my best behavior.
Because otherwise, you don't know what to say, right?
I'm just going to read the first page of this. When you entered the executive offices of Mercury Pictures International, you would first see a scale model of the studio itself. Artie Feldman, co-founder and head of production, installed it in the lobby to distract skittish investors from second thoughts. Complete with backlot, sound stages, and facilities buildings, the miniature was a faithful replica of the 10-acre studio in which it sat. Maria Lagana, as rendered by the miniaturist, was a tiny, featureless figure looking out of Artie's office window. And this is where the real Maria stood late one morning in 1941, hands holstered on her hips, watching a pigeon autograph the windshield of her boss's new convertible. She would like to buy that bird a drink. "It's a beautiful day out, Art," Maria said. "You really should come take a look." "I have," Artie said. It made me want to jump. Artie wasn't known for his joie de vivre, but he usually didn't fantasize about ending it all this close to lunch. Maria wondered if the Senate investigation into motion picture war propaganda was giving him agita. But no, the crisis at hand was on his head. His bald spot had finally grown too large for his toupee to conceal. 6 other black toupees were shellacked atop wooden mannequin heads on the shelf behind his desk, where a more successful producer might display his Oscars. They were conversation starters, as in Artie began conversations with new employees by telling them the toupees were the scalps of their predecessors. As far as Maria could tell, the 6 hairpieces were the same indistinguishable model and style, but Artie had become convinced that each one crackled with the karmic energy of the hair's original head, unrealized and awaiting release, like a static charge smuggled into a fingertip. Thus, he'd named his toupees after their personalities. The heavyweight, the Casanova, the optimist, the Edison, the Odysseus, and the Mephistopheles. Artie had never felt more at home in his adoptive country than when he learned the founding fathers had all worn toupees, even that showboat, John Hancock. The only one who hadn't was Benjamin Franklin. Look how he turned out. A syphilitic Francophile who got his jollies flying kites in the rain. So, Frank Lloyd Wright once supposedly said that if you tip the world on its side, all the loose pieces will land in Los Angeles. And this was never more true than it was in the 1930s and 40s, when thousands of refugees fleeing fascism and the war in Europe landed in LA. And many of them ended up working in the movie industry. The most famous, would be Billy Wilder, Fritz Lang, directors of that stature, but many more were working on the margins of Hollywood. You had internationally celebrated playwrights like Bertolt Brecht writing B-movie pot boilers for chump change. You had German Jewish actors who, because of their accents, could only find roles playing the very Nazis they thought they had escaped. When America entered the war, many of these refugees and immigrants were foundational to the American movie propaganda apparatus. But as citizens of Axis-aligned countries, they were classified as enemy aliens and denied the very rights that their movies championed. And so this is the wider world of Mercury Pictures, and its story really focuses on this woman, Maria Lagana, and her boss, Artie, who are trying to captain this foundering B-movie studio that has become a nexus for refugees and immigrants during this time period.
All right. Excellent. And one of the things that is fascinating to me as I read both of these books is there are so many places where they overlap. Where Barbara with Dolores starts out in the silent pictures, she makes that fraught change over to speaking pictures, to talkies, when a lot of those silent picture stars didn't make it, but so much of the same ideas are in your books. But one of the questions that I have is, how did you guys actually get to Hollywood, to writing about Hollywood? And I would imagine for Barbara that it was probably Frida Kahlo as the launching off point for connecting into Dolores Del Rio. Is that sort of where you got to it?
Yeah, that is true. I grew up in Los Angeles, so that world is not completely alien to me. And when I was young, we used to go to the Mexican movies. It was one bus ride up Wilshire Boulevard, uptown. So, but when I really became interested in Dolores Del Rio was when I wrote Frida, because Dolores Del Rio was part of that group, part of Frida's entourage, and she was completely different from Frida. So it was interesting for me. Frida was very brash. She liked to attract attention. She liked to use swear words. She liked to go to cocktail parties in Los Angeles or other places in the United States and meet with these very, very, very stuck-up women and say something really obscene to them, and then say, "Oh, I thought that meant good afternoon in English." So Dolores del Rio was just the opposite. She had her wild side, and she had plenty of affairs, and she was married 3 times, but she had a really long and hot affair with Orson Welles. But she was the image of decorum. She fostered that image. She nurtured that image. She was elegant. She appeared in fashion magazines. She was not only beautiful, she was chic, sleek, well-mannered. She always knew what to say. She learned English. She worked hard. She was a very hard worker. She didn't take it for granted. She knew she worked on her pronunciation, and she really tried to play the lady, the Catholic lady, that she was described as in the newspapers. So it was interesting because there were 2 sides. On the one hand, her mother was the head of the Señoras Católicas de Los Ángeles or something like that. And Dolores del Rio was also cultivated that she was a sincere, devout Catholic. And her cousin, Ramon Navarro, who's also a character in the play, was a very sincere, devout Catholic, which is another theme in the book, because he was gay. And then there's this psychological conflict between, between what he feels is his duty to God and his own inclinations. So that's another thread. But so all of these things really came into perspective as I wrote Frida, and I thought, Dolores del Rio really deserves her own novel.
Absolutely. And so you famously moved from Chechnya through Russia and now to Hollywood.
It's a natural progression.
Of course it is. Well, and again, you talk about that originally the title was Sunny Siberia because so many of these exiles, they had to leave their home countries for all the ugly reasons that people were being pushed out. And where did they end up? They ended up in L.A., where everything collects, right?
Yeah. So my first 2 books were set in the former Soviet Union, and after spending a number of years in that world, I was ready to come in from the cold, and Los Angeles seemed like as good a place as any to do that. I found myself coming to Hollywood in part because it was a way to really continue building on some of the ideas and themes that had interested me in A Constellation of Vital Phenomena and The Tsar of Love and Techno. While the golden age of Hollywood probably is about as existentially remote from 1990s Chechnya or 1930s Leningrad as you would imagine. In some ways, I found that the ideas of how do political pressures change how we understand history? How does fantasy and reality converge? Some of the big ideas and questions that animated those 2 books were really natural fits for Hollywood. I think that as a novelist, I'm always looking for settings where anything can happen, and anything does happen in Hollywood during this era. And I found myself, as I was researching this book, just being absolutely fascinated with Hollywood, sort of as a microcosm for the great events happening far beyond the LA city limits. I think that we return to World War II again and again, in movies, in film, excuse me, in film, in books, in TV, because World War II is to our contemporary world maybe what the Trojan War was to antiquity. It's sort of a way of measuring good and evil. It's this huge, become this mythological event filled with these larger than life characters. And I think that that because of that, it's sometimes hard to lose sight. It's easy to lose sight of some of these very minor peripheral figures. And in a way, that's what this book was trying to gather together. I think that historical fiction sort of is an opportunity to hold on to the characters who fall through the pages of big biographies and doorstopper histories, and that was the case with this book.
Well, what's interesting is that virtually everybody in Barbara's book is a historical figure. And it's fascinating because as a kid, I loved Hollywood movies, particularly musicals, MGM musicals. But I was big into the whole 1930s, 1940s Hollywood. And so much of what Ms. Del Rio talks about touches on all of those, the sort of that glamour. But so many people are historical characters, whereas in your book, almost the only historical character is Bela Lugosi, right? He makes a cameo. It's lovely. So it's kind of interesting that you use the framework, but you're populated with basically almost entirely fictional characters, whereas your book is so populated with historical characters. So I'm wondering, your protagonist, your narrator, is Marra, who is fictional. And so how did you come to her? How did you find her as your center for telling your story?
Well, I have to admit that this book is actually the second draft. It's not the first draft. Well, maybe it's the 20th draft, but it's certainly not the first draft. So when I read over the first draft, it seemed to me that that it was hard to relate, that the reader would have difficulty relating to Dolores del Rio, because Dolores del Rio was protected from so many of the things that happen in daily life, and all the historical phenomena that we have been talking about. So she was from a wealthy family. She did escape from Mexico during the Revolutionary War. So her family was affected by the Mexican Revolution. But after she got to Hollywood, she was from a wealthy family, and then she made a lot of money, and she didn't have children. And so the polio epidemic that frightened people to death, they were so afraid that their children would get polio. It was much worse than the COVID epidemic that we just went through. World War II, first of all, the Depression didn't affect her. She didn't invest in stock. She invested in real estate, and she was also independently wealthy. And Hollywood continued to make movies, so she was buffered. I mean, from that, and then the war. So I really thought that I needed a narrator to make the character more relatable, and also to connect more with the reader. So I think that Marra fulfills two of my goals. One was to make the character more relatable, because Marra is married. She has 4 little girls. Her husband loses his job during the Depression. They go through the scare of the polio epidemic. They're convinced that one of their children has polio. It turns out that she doesn't. But they go through all of the terrors of of raising a family. And then the war starts, and her husband goes into the army. He was one of many, many thousands of Mexican Americans who wanted to fight because they wanted to show that they were real Americans. So she fulfilled that goal. But the other goal has to do with the very technique of biofiction. When you write biofiction, you're writing somebody's life, and you always have to be aware. As an author, I'm acutely aware that I'm not that person. And so I am putting words into the mouths of people who actually existed, and I'm not those people. And I think it's hard enough even to know what you're thinking yourself, right? It's hard enough to analyze your own motives and know what you really want, and even to remember what you really said. But when it comes to another person, then the obstacle is even greater. So by having Marra tell the story, Marra is something of an unreliable narrator. She's not sure of things, so she will say, "Well, this is what I remember. This is what happened. This is what I said. But at least that's the way I remember it." And then she'll, "Well, maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that isn't what she was thinking," and so that way we add a degree of subjectivity to the novel that I think has to be there in biofiction. I think it's important to have that buffer created so that we're never assuming something about a historical figure that we don't know for sure.
And so in Mercury Pictures Presents, you have points of view of many, many characters. And anyway, there's so many things I want to explore about all the different ways that you, everybody has their story arc, right? Almost every character, you see how they progress through time, which is just wonderful. It's that, everybody should be the hero of their own story, right? And in your books, we love that in A Constellation of Vital Phenomenon, that everybody gets to have their story arc where you know how they ended up, right? So even though we're still sitting in 1948, we're hearing how they ended up in 1972 or something like that. But one of the things that fascinates me is that we find the moral center in characters where you would not have expected it. Like, what's fascinating to me is that Artie, whom, Maria is happy that that pigeon is pooping all over his car, is really this incredibly moral human being, which you would never expect, right, from the guy who cares about whether his toupees cover his bald spot. And then back in San Lorenzo, the inspector, who is known for completely fabricating all of his reports, is this. It turns out that he's this incredibly moral man, and so I'm just wondering how you sort of found those pockets of the people who are trying to do the right thing, even when they seem like not the people who are going to be the ones who do the right thing.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it was actually something that developed out of my first novel, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, which is set in a hospital in Chechnya, and the two main characters are named Sonia and Ahmed, and in the published version of the book, Sonia is this sort of ruthlessly efficient surgeon, and this guy who sort of becomes her sidekick, for lack of a better term, is known as the worst surgeon in Chechnya, and he ends up becoming the real moral center of the entire book, and the first draft of that novel the Ahmed character was essentially George Clooney in ER. He was, this handsome, suave,
But perhaps morally not so.
Well, he was very upstanding, and he excelled in all things. And I realized that that's actually a pretty boring character. That we might feel a lot of things for George Clooney, but sympathy probably isn't one of them. We feel, I think a greater sense of sympathy for a Seth Rogen than for a George Clooney. And I think there's something about people who have considerable limitations, shall we say, who are nonetheless trying to push up against those limitations. That kind of moral drama in a novel feels to me much more interesting than somebody who is a do-gooder who is going to do good throughout the entire book. And so somebody like Artie, who is in charge of this sort of foundering studio, he sort of in many ways is an imperfect person. He is
his son pisses in his laundry every couple days, right?
Yes, which happens to be an autobiographical detail.
Excellent.
My poor dad is woke up to many a soggy undershirt.
Okay, that's the fun fact from here on out. Okay.
Yeah, Artie is sort of in many ways is not a heroic person, and yet he has this sense of just a very simple, the kind of sense of right and wrong that I imagine most people probably have, even if they. Even if we often choose to ignore it, and he chooses not to, and he ends up falling afoul of the U.S. Senate in the 1930s as he sort of goes on this anti-fascist crusade with his movies, which was seen as being very provocative and out of step with the politics, the isolationist politics of the time.
Right. Yeah, again, it's interesting to see so many things about how truly isolationist the U.S. was right before we got bombed, and again how that truly did run you afoul of the authorities, especially when you're running a movie studio. But of course, his timing ends up being impeccable, and there you go. But one of the things that we have a few more minutes before we're going to open it up for questions, so be thinking of the incisive, exciting questions that you would like to ask these two, and I'll ask a couple more, and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. So one of the things that goes through both of your novels has to do with identity, and again, in Hollywood, right, we're all about changing identities, right, and so. But then you have people who are kind of forced to change identities, whether they wanted to or not. People who, one of the conversations we were having right before this is that in Hollywood there was like a hierarchy of ethnicities, of whether you were allowed to be, you couldn't be Mexican, you had to be European, you had to be Spanish royalty to be passed off to American audiences as somebody that they would pay to go see a movie. That Maria's great love, Eddie, is a Chinese American. He's been his whole family has been in the United States for generations, but he is an other, and the anti-Chinese laws, especially in California, meant that Maria and Eddie were not allowed to be married. They were not allowed to be together, and that you couldn't Asians were never allowed to play Asians like Hungarians played Asians, so there was this hierarchy of who you were allowed to be. And so it just it's fascinating to me how you guys played around with identity as part of the plots of what you were talking about. So
Yeah. What probably my favorite relationship in the novel is between Maria, this Italian emigre who comes to America, comes to Los Angeles as a child, and Eddie, who is a third generation Chinese American Californian, and they come from completely different backgrounds. Eddie has never left the Los Angeles city limits. He's never used a suitcase. Whereas Maria has literally traveled halfway around the world, and yet the two of them are able to sort of see in each other so much, to recognize and understand and support one another. I always have a lot of trouble with love stories, and I felt like this was the one, definitely my favorite love story. But sort of circling back to the idea of including historical figures, I allowed myself a single historical figure to appear in the novel, and it was Bela Lugosi and this friendship he has with Eddie. Again, two people who have vastly different experiences, and yet following America's entry into the war, all of a sudden there were opportunities for Chinese and Korean American actors, really for the first time in many years, in which they were, of course, forced to play Japanese villains.
Right.
And Eddie has this real sense of moral conflict about wanting to take something from this industry that has taken so much from him, and a real sense of being repulsed by these caricatures and racist stereotypes that he's asked to perform. And he and Bela Lugosi, of all people, really have a lot in common, and they sort of spend this wonderful afternoon together, sort of psychoanalyzing their respective personas that they have to inhabit.
yeah. And so again, with Dolores, she sort of inhabits so many. She goes through so many phases, and then Marra is so not interested in any of that glitz and glamour. And
But I think that in terms of identity, the case of Lola is extremely important. She is successful because she is exotic. She is thrust into the limelight because she is exotic. But she is marketed as a Spanish aristocrat and not as a Mexican, not in her case, because Mexicans aren't considered glamorous, but because there were miscegenation laws that absolutely forbade showing a Mexican or people of different races in a romantic relationship on the screen. So in order for her to play opposite Joel McCrea, for example, as she did in Bird of Paradise, or any of the male leads that she had to be marketed as white. She never denied that she was Mexican. She was proud of her Mexican heritage. And when she went back to Mexico, she was always cast as an Indian woman, which was kind of ridiculous because she also didn't look much like a Mexican Indian either. But this was a real historical problem or circumstance that could have actually paralyzed her career. But she allowed herself to be converted into a product because actresses and actors were products of the studios, and that's how she was marketed, and that's why she was so successful. But then when it got to be we got closer to the war, then that wasn't as acceptable anymore because she was still considered foreign.
okay, I will open it up to our audience, and I will try to remember to repeat the question. Go ahead.
Anthony, could you speak to the fact that the studio built the replicas of the German cities?
So the question is, can you speak to the fact that the studio built the replica of the German cities, German village?
Yeah, so this is a section that appears sort of towards the tail end of the novel, and it's about this project called German Village, which was a collaboration between Hollywood set designers, German emigre architects, Standard Oil chemists, and the U.S. military. A series of replica Berlin tenement blocks were constructed in the Utah desert, and these were really just absurdly accurate. All of the furnishings were either purchased secondhand in German American neighborhoods, or they were fashioned by German POWs. The floorboards were shipped over the North Pole from Murmansk, from disassembled apartment buildings in Murmansk, because the timber was quite similar to the timber used in Berlin tenements. Every night, firefighters would go around dousing these replica structures with hoses, not because anything was on fire, but because they wanted the humidity levels of the wooden framing to be similar to that you would find in Berlin. There were books on the bookshelf in each apartment. There were linens in the closet. So why would the U.S. Army, in collaboration with these other organizations, go to such tremendous effort and expend such resources to create this replica Berlin in the middle of Utah? It was because they were trying to figure out how to start a firestorm. And so these, within the world of the book, this miniaturist who builds the miniature that appears in the first paragraph of the novel, is brought out to to the middle of Utah to help construct this German village, and she herself is a grew up in Berlin. She left her son there when she emigrated, and is profoundly homesick. And she must sort of the price for returning to Berlin, even if it's in the middle of Utah, is to abet the real Berlin's destruction, and the kind of the moral and ethical complexities that those real figures who were involved with this project faced. I just found absolutely unbelievable, and so that was what inspired that chapter. Thank you.
Let's see, over here.
What happened to Mercury studio? That's it developed into something else?
Mercury Pictures is a fictional studio.
Not exist.
Yeah, it did not exist. Yeah.
Perfectly fictional. Yes, sir, over here.
Question for Barbara about biofiction. My wife belongs to a book club. She has to read a book every month. I say, "What are you reading?" And she tells me. I said, "Is it fiction or nonfiction?" She says, "I don't know." I said, "Well, don't you care?" And she doesn't seem to care, which I don't get. But you had a real story. How do you make the decision that you're going to write a biography or you're going to write biofiction?
So the question is, how do you decide that you're going to write either a biography that would be fully nonfiction or biofiction, that is fictionalized biography?
So, I don't know if you're familiar with the writer Mario Vargas Llosa, who's a Peruvian writer, but he has a book called The Truth in Fiction. And what he says is, you get to the truth, the way to really get to the truth is through fiction. Because when you read, for example, if you read the story of the Vietnam War, a historical account of the Vietnam War, right? You get a lot of dates, a lot of battles, a lot of facts. If you read Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, which is fiction, but it really gets to the core of what the soldiers felt while they were in Vietnam. That's a book that's going to make you, it's going to tear out your guts. It's going to make you cry. It's going to make you want to put it down, and then you can't. So I feel that way about biofiction. I could tell the story of Frida or Saint Teresa uh, with a bunch of facts, but when you write a bio novel, then what you try to do is get into your subject's head, reconstruct the context. When I write a book like this, when I construct a character like Marra, I ask myself, what would it be like to know somebody like Dolores del Rio, with all of her self-centeredness, and yet all of her desire to do good, and all of her conflicts, and the inner conflicts of someone like Ramon. It really forces you to get into the character. So I have a novel called Sister Teresa, based on the life of Teresa de Avila. It's not a religious book. It's a novel about a woman who turned out to be a Catholic saint, but she wasn't. I like to say, but before she was a saint, she was no saint. And I asked myself, that she was said to levitate. Personally, I don't believe in levitation, but she was said to levitate. So there's a narrator in that book too, and I asked myself, supposing Jenny levitated, what would that be like to be sitting next to a person who suddenly levitated? What would you feel? What would it be like to be in that world? And in the book, somebody asks the narrator, did you see her, did she levitate? And she says, well, I didn't see it. He says, well, everybody says she levitated. Well, I didn't see it. Well, it's the same thing with Dolores del Rio. Did this really happen? What really happened? What was she feeling? What was she thinking? Why did she do it? What was the context? What was the social context? What was the psychological context? What did she feel like when she realized she was married to a man who was much too old for her, Jaime del Rio, her first husband, and was probably gay. Was gay. And that's something that the biographies don't go into, but this is something that you explore the possibility of in biofiction.
So just one quick follow-up. If you get to a point in Dolores' life that you think it would be much more interesting to the reader if it wasn't the way Dolores did it, would you tweak it and change it, or are you going for the truth?
No, I would not change the facts. I think I guess it's my many years of a university professor that and telling students, you didn't check the facts, you didn't go to the primary sources. I would never do that. I know that there are authors who do that. There are authors of biofiction who do, to make it more interesting. There's Five Black Ships, for example, is a novel of Magellan, and at the end Magellan sails back to Spain. That's not what happened. I would never do that. I think that the fictionalized part comes in the invention of the character and the invention of dialogue and the invention of secondary characters who provide the context for the primary character the protagonist to act. But changing what we know to be the historical truth, I would not change that.
And I think we have time for one more quick question in the back. So a question about how Anthony was doing research into his time period.
Yeah, one of the great things about researching and writing a novel set in this time period is you can sit on your couch watching old movies on a Tuesday afternoon and swear that you're hard at work. So that was my primary means of research. But But I sort of immersed myself in histories of Hollywood, of LA. About a third of the book is set in Italy, so I was sort of reading everything I could get my hands on. Set in LA in that time period. It was a really interesting change from working on my first two books, just because there isn't a huge body of literature on on Chechnya, whereas the body of literature on Hollywood and fascism would, occupy a couple of buildings. So I really had to pick and choose which sources seemed the most useful. One of the best books I found was by the wonderfully named Hortense Powdermaker, who was an anthropologist, and she essentially decided to look at Hollywood in the early 40s as an anthropologist, as one of her colleagues, going to Papua New Guinea might look at, the taboos and the power structures and all of that within that similar society. So I tried to kind of get my hands on everything, and as I'm always constantly writing and researching at the same time. There's sort of this beautiful feedback loop where you begin, you're writing a scene and you have to look something up, and that leads you to reconsider how you will write the next scene. It was about 4 years into writing this project that I stumbled into the German village details, and that completely sort of reframed the book. So it was a lot of reading, a lot of watching. My in-laws live in Long Beach, so we go to LA a few times a year. So I got to constantly walk around the streets in which these characters found themselves.
All right, unfortunately, we are out of time.